Hello, everyone. My name is Anna Grzma-Busa. I'm the director of the Europe Center here at Stanford University. And we're absolutely delighted to have Saumitra Jha with us today. He's an associate professor at the Stanford School of Business, a senior fellow at the Freeman-Spogli Institute, and the founder and director of the Stanford Conflict and Polarization Lab. And his work uses contemporary and historical data, both observational and experimental, to ask critical questions about the way identity, contact between groups, and even commercial interactions, such as trade and investment, shape how we see each other and how likely we are to enter into conflict with each other. Professor Jha's research has been published in some of the most prestigious journals in both political science and economics, and he has won major prizes both for his teaching and for his research. And today we're delighted to welcome him to the Europe Center as he explores how popular war heroes, put up on pedestals by both societies and elites, can legitimize anti-democratic and even fascist politics, a topic I wish were not so relevant to our current situation. So please join me in welcoming Saum as he presents Heroes and Villains, the effects of combat heroism on autocratic values and Nazi collaboration in France. Welcome, Saum.
Thank you so much, Anna. It's a real delight to be here. So, the parallels between what we saw on January 6th with the storming of the Capitol and what we saw in France on February 6th, 1934 are quite striking. In their thousands, right-wing groups marched towards the Senate House in France. They marched under many different insignia and banners, including far-right, avowedly racist organizations. Some believe reports spread through right-wing media of a deep state conspiracy. Others sought to show strength that would weaken or lead to the end of the left-wing government, which had been elected to power with a slender majority and which some equated with communism. Still others marched against the Jews. What gave the demonstration a deeper potential for escalation still was the presence of members of well-organized veterans groups. These veterans included decorated heroes who had sacrificed much in service to their country. But what of their commitment to democratic processes and values when they had chosen the wrong side or the sides that had lost an election? In fact, these included the Croix de Faux, which were headed by this gentleman here, the French equivalent of Randall Biggs, who headed the Proud Boys in Florida and was also a military veteran. Now, the coverage of what happened in France that day was very different as well. It was polarized in the media. The left called it a fascist coup that failed. The right called it the assassination of martyrs in the cause of freedom after the rigged corruption that had happened just before as well. In fact, France itself had become weakened in face of the crises to come. The French Third Republic has survived for 70 years. It's still the longest lived in French history. It had weathered the Commune. It had weathered World War I, in which 7% of males had been killed. It also weathered the Spanish influenza pandemic. But there had been erosion of democratic values in the interwar period and an extreme polarization. In fact, to the extent that by 1936, some on the right would say that they'd rather have Hitler rule the country than Leon Blum, who was the socialist prime minister and also happened to be Jewish. There were 26 separate cabinets, in fact, in France between the period 1930 and 1940 alone. And you might think, well, a lot of what happened in France in terms of the destruction of its democracy had to do with these folks walking through Paris in 1940, in June 1940. But actually, the French Republic actually committed suicide in 1940. Unlike other countries which were facing German invasion, the French Republic, the legitimate authorities of France, voted to stay and vote away their own powers to Marshal Pétain, who had been a hero of France in World War I. So rather than forming a government in exile, as had been done in Poland, in the Netherlands, in Norway, in many other countries, the French stayed and they voted away and voted to end their republic. In fact, many believed that France, both on the left and the right, that France needed a national renewal and they needed a hero to do so, to help them. So one question that's kind of come up a lot in recent years in the United States, but it's a perennial question, I think, in political science and political economy is, how do democracies die? Well, if you believe the Washington Post, the democracies die in darkness. In an important recent book by Levitsky and Ziblatt, they point to the fact that the way the democracies often die is when gatekeepers, that belong to the major political parties are, for opportunistic, short-term opportunistic reasons, admit would-be authoritarians into the democratic process themselves. So it doesn't happen as much by coup, as much by gatekeepers allowing this to happen. However, at the same time, even though it was the case, I think when I was a young lad learning about democracy in my mom's lap, that we used to believe that democracies kind of were an absorbing state, that once you're a democracy, kind of stuck democracy, and maybe the Weimar Republic wasn't a great example, but there is a truth that there's a growing awareness that relatively few young democracies consolidate, but they do appear to grow more resilient as they survive. If you manage to stick with it, with democracy for a while, you're probably going to survive a bit longer. And in fact, democratic values held by citizens who are willing to resist these kind of the turning back of the clock are seen as key in democratic resilience in recent work. So our question is, what role can heroes play in shaping values in resilient democracies? And to what extent can they actually play a special role precisely because they're heroes in legitimizing positions which otherwise might be seen as repugnant? Now, these could be positions which are actually controversial but very pro-democratic. For example, Lafayette bringing the American ideas of democracy to France. They could also be Yitzhak Rabin, who is of course a hero in Israel, being able to reach across and during the Oslo Accords. But they could also be Charles Lindbergh, who was a hero who had flown across the Atlantic and was able to get some support for his America First agenda in 1941. Of course, heroes emerge from specific circumstances, and the people around them who support them do as well. So one thing that we are doing in this paper is trying to measure the effects of a network of politically influential values as a potential individuals on democratic values. Now, of course, networks, heroes, they all come from the context. So what we need is an experiment, a way to kind of get an exogenous network of politically influential individuals. And we are studying France as an example of when that happened. So what we do is we exploit the incidental assignment of Philippe Pétain, who I've already mentioned, along with the troops that were exogenously rotated under his command at Verdun, the crucial Battle of Verdun in World War I, to estimate the effects of exposure to heroic networks in World War I to potentially repugnant autocratic values after the war in the home communes of the soldiers who served under Pétain. Already in 1934, after the riots that I was mentioning, newspapers on both the left and the right said Pétain is the one we need to bring France away from the crisis. We're going to see to what extent is that reflected in anti-democratic values and autocratic collaboration with the Nazis in World War II. We're going to do this using a secret intelligence file collected by French Army intelligence in 1945, listing more than 97,000 individual collaborators and the organizations which they participated in. These include deep economic collaboration with the Nazis, joining extreme right-wing political parties, joining militia, which sought to fight against the resistance and hunt Jews, as well as direct Nazi collaboration with the Nazi government, including joining the Gestapo and the Waffen-SS. We're going to compare communes whose regiments happened to be sent to Verdun under Pétain to others that were sent even just after to Verdun, but under a different commander. We find that being assigned to Verdun under Pétain raises the share of Nazi collaborators in the home communes of those regiments by around 7 to 10 percentage points. It affects all forms of collaboration that I just mentioned: economic, political, military, and Nazi, and diffuses beyond the veterans themselves. This is not a closed network. In fact, it diffuses to women, it diffuses to the elderly and to the young in the home communities of the people who served under Pétain. at Verdun. Furthermore, these effects seem to be reflected in values and voting as well. So we find that the effects that begin to emerge in the 1924 elections and become accentuated in by the 1930s, the polarized period, in a way that mimics Pétain's own political views and accentuates France's polarization. These effects also prove persistent after the war, even after Pétain himself has been thrown in jail for high treason and died in 1951. And with these views, being manifested in an increase in support for right-wing parties during periods that are accentuated in periods of social crisis, like in 1956-58, during the Algerian War, during the civil demonstrations in 1968, and the election of the first socialist president of France in 1981, which was many saw as a potential threat to French internal stability. So our setting is the Inferno of Verdun, which was called the Stalingrad of World War II. In fact, Stalingrad was called the Verdun of, World War II, because it was bad. It was really bad. It was the longest battle in history, arguably a turning point in the war. Around 40 to 60 million shells fell, with more than 708,000 casualties and more than 305,000 people killed. You can compare that to the number of people, all of the US deaths in World War II and in its gravest battle, Antietam, just for comparison. And yet, Verdun wasn't the deadliest battle for France in World War II. Verdun itself was actually a quiet sector in 1916, but it was of great symbolic importance. This is where it was the last fortress to surrender to Prussia in 1870. It was where the treaty was held, which actually carved out the boundaries of what would become France, the Holy Roman Empire, and Lotharingia in between. There had been a secret German buildup, actually using tunnels in advance of the battle. And so the French soldiers and commanders did not know what was going to come and hit them. Pétain himself happened to be available because he'd been pulled off the line 6 weeks prior, and I'll get back to this in a moment. He didn't expect to be assigned to the front at the time. But once he did, he instituted what was known as the noria, or a mill wheel bucket system. Basically, just like a bucket, mill wheels on an old French water mill, which the buckets go into the water and come out. This was an idea where regiments would be rotated through the front and then be rested and then go back to the front over time. And so this actually absorbed, as I'm going to show you, like 80% of the French line regiments served at Verdun at some point during this really long battle. This was part of a general principle of French deployment that the regiments should be, even though recruited in specific locations, would be deployed interchangeably and not be so individual places or regions would not be more adversely affected than others by the war. So as I mentioned, 80% of the 173 French line regiments had rotated through December, and around half of these were under Marshal Pétain. He wasn't a marshal until the next year. However, because of this, more soldiers had this simple badge of honor that after the war, they could just simply claim, "J'ai fait Verdun," I served at Verdun. And that was enough for people to understand what they went through and the heroism that they had displayed. Just to give you a sense of how we construct this data, basically we use the regimental histories of every regiment in the French army. We tie this to a military dictionary of communes, which shows you where they are for every commune in France, and there are around 33,000 of them. They're kind of equivalent to a US census block. It says which regiment that a commune belongs to and where its bureau of recruitment is. We tie that to the subregions which are connected to each regiment. And then we're able to kind of get a sense of whether you were exposed to Verdun or not and when. So these deep blue ones, subregions, were exposed in February 1916. The light blue, some of the regiments that were from there were assigned, but not all of them. And the white ones were not assigned in February. So this is at the beginning of the battle. In March, this was the assignment. In April, this. In May, at the beginning of May, Pétain was promoted away from command. So but people continued to be rotated through Verdun. July began the Somme offensive. So there were some deviation there, but our troops continued to be rotated during this period. So our comparison is basically to compare places that were sent to fight under Pétain at Verdun just before and just after his promotion away from command, and to see how that affects their potential. That creates a network of people with shared heroism with Pétain. And we're going to track those communes over time to see how their political views and views on autocratic values change over time as well. So these are the treatment and control communes. This is Verdun, and this is the kind of the major supply line to Verdun that was also established by Pétain in 1916. Now, crucially, we want to, if the experiment is a valid experiment, it should be the case that those places which were assigned to Pétain and Verdun were not different before the treatment, before they were fought with him under his command. And so to get at that, we collected by hand these French electoral returns from 1914. And as you can see, there aren't kind of obvious distinctions between in the vote share for the right, or indeed for the left or any other party in the last elections before World War I in France. In fact, this is reflected in other types of votes in 1914. There's no difference in both comparing across France and within the same département of France. It's also the case that they're similar in population. They're also similar. The Germans also did not think that they were different. The Germans did not try to occupy places which had Pétainist histories versus others in a disproportionate number of ways. They did not fight longer against the Germans, and they were not as more or less likely to be in Vichy France, which was the quasi-independent zone until the Germans occupied it in November 1942. So this is just making the point, again, that even if you look party by party, these places were very similar, not only in their vote for the right parties, but also for their vote for the left, including the Socialist Party, which under Jean Jaurès was actually the most pacifist in the run-up to World War I. Now, Pétain was an unlikely hero, but he became a creeping authoritarian. He was not a master manipulator of party politics like Stalin, and he was not a charismatic demagogue, like Hitler or Mussolini. In fact, his nickname when he was a professor at the École de Guerre was Précis le Sec, which means he was cold the dry. His delivery was not as exciting as, he wasn't a tub thumper by any means, right? So he came from a peasant background. He graduated in a very mediocre fashion from Saint-Cyr, and he was a simple colonel on the verge of retirement in 1914. He actually happened to be available after the surprise attack, as I mentioned. He was, but he didn't expect to be called. In fact, he was in a hotel near the Gare du Nord in Paris with his mistress when he was actually summoned to the front of Verdun. He wasn't expecting to be called at all. However, he did stabilize the front, and he was a soldier's general, and he was deemed a hero of Verdun by the press from that point onwards, so much so that the other French generals kind of didn't like the fact that he was getting so much attention and decided to promote him away from command. He was promoted as a Marshal of France in 1918. And already, though, he understood, and this is according to his own best man at his wedding, who was himself a Marshal, Fayolle, that he believes that the Republic fears him and he believes he is a great man. He adopted increasingly authoritarian values in the 1920s, particularly after serving in the Rif War with Primo de Rivera, and who was, of course, the dictator in Spain. And he actually is on record saying in 1925 that he hoped similar things would happen in France. However, he wasn't actively involved. He was an anti-communist, and everyone knew that. He was actively involved in veterans organizations and continued to give speeches in those venues. But he only intervened publicly in French politics in 1936, when it became clear that the left were likely to win that election. However, despite that, he was actually well loved even on the left. Leon Blum called him, one of France's great general, a great soldier. Newspapers on the left after the riots in 1934, as well as on the right, were asked saying that Pétain is who we need to save the Republic. He was recalled he was already 84, however, in 1940. He was recalled as the Spanish ambassador to bolster the French military opposition during the Blitzkrieg and advocated for an armistice. In fact, he replaced Paul Reynaud, who was the Prime Minister of France when he resigned. Reynaud was pushing for government in exile, and there was even discussions of having a Franco-British Union where France and Britain would become part of the same country to continue the battle. But these were all rejected. Instead, Pétain, who was advocating for an armistice, was voted full powers by the French Parliament. Immediately, he began what he called the National Revolution. Even the rallying cry of the revolution and the motto of contemporary France, Liberté, Fraternité, Égalité, was banned in favor of work, family, and fatherland. The Vichy regime adopted an increasingly anti-Semitic and authoritarian set of policies, in fact, far in advance of what the Germans were asking for at that time, as well as open collaboration with Germany following a famous meeting at Montoire between Pétain and Hitler. With the Allied landings in North Africa, the Germans occupied the free zone, and Pétain ultimately entered house arrest and was forced into exile in Germany after the D-Day landings. He returned to France actually voluntarily to face trial for treason, believing that he would be acquitted. However, he was condemned to die. De Gaulle commuted his sentence to imprisonment, and that's what happened. He died in prison in 1951. Our data set consists of 97,000, more than 97,000 individual collaborators from 1945. And it was collected by this gentleman, Paul Peillol, who was of the Second Bureau. He was actually served in the Armistice Army in the Vichy regime, but then joined the Free French in North Africa and became head of Army Intel for the Free French in 1945. So the actual kind of underlying data was in many ways captured by the resistance from the archives of collaborating organizations during this period. So you can see, just as an example, that in some cases we have the jobs of the people, we have where they live, and we have the organizations that they belong to, as well as their birth dates in a number of cases. This just shows you, many of you know Paris. This just shows you how OCD we are about our data, just showing you the location of these individual collaborators in 1945 based on their home address. And this is what it looks like if you kind of normalize it in per capita terms using the 1936. This is normalizing by population. You can see there is a fair amount of variation across France in the degree to which different individuals, the share of collaboration that occurred. However, it's much more accentuated in places which had served under Pétain at Verdun. And in fact, it's if you compare it in a regression setting, it's around 7 percentage points increase in the share of collaborators. This is a kind of a very robust relationship, which is consistent whether you control for the initial vote shares in 1940 or in the wartime World War II experience, or use departmental fixed effects. So comparing communes within the same department, there's around 90 odd departments in France. This shows you the distribution of the actual forms of collaboration. Most of them are political parties like the RNP, but there are also the Milices Françaises, which were this group which actively tried to hunt down the resistance, which was founded by Pétain in 1943. There are fewer that kind of engaged in kind of direct German collaboration, but they still exist as well. What I want to point out is, though, that these effects that we find for Verdun and the Pétain communes actually exist across the board, not just within a closed private network of people benefiting from connections with Pétain. It's also not just people who are of military age males during this period. It's true, the effects exist a bit stronger for them, but they also diffuse for women and for those who are too young to serve and too old to serve as well. So this suggests a diffusion beyond the individuals who serve directly under his command at Verdun. Importantly, what we find, and I think this is something I want to really discuss with you, because I think this is one of the big takeaways for our contemporary, what we're seeing right now, is that the effects are that having his leadership and having this network, exogenous network of heroes, were complements. So what you find is the effects come from serving under Pétain at Verdun, but not being at Verdun and being a hero without Pétain having served with Pétain. It's also the case that it wasn't just because you knew Pétain back in the day that you're more likely to support his views after the war and have this influence on Nazi collaboration. It's also not the case that the other great hero of World War I, Marcel Foch's network, had the same effect. So it really does seem to be the case that Pétain's influence is strengthened and diffused through the network. And members of that network are themselves more influential the more their leader is viewed as a hero. But if you think about this, the implications as complementarity between the two are several. In fact, the idea of monotone comparative statics requires, in some sense, an idea of complementarity. First, if you have complementary relationships, if you have this heroic identity which stems from your connection with a heroic leader, you have more of an incentive to build further incentives to invest in the network, in the organizations of the network, the newspapers of the network, even the beliefs, because that increases your influence among people around you. And this can lead to increasing differences over time. People become get deeper into the network, and it becomes harder to turn back. It can also generate persistence. If you believe that you're a hero and the leader you served with is a hero, even when he's discredited as a villain, it's very hard for you to turn around and say, no, I no longer agree with this. And I think, and you're surrounded by people who have a similar view. You invested a lot of your kind of economic resources as well as social resources in this network. Turning back becomes much more difficult. One example of this is Joseph Davno, who is actually, he joined the French army in 1916, and he was just in time to serve under Pétain at Verdun in February 1916. He actually was a war hero. He received the Médaille Militaire from Pétain himself, and he was later inducted into the Legion of Honor. He became active in right-wing veterans organizations in the interwar period, including some of those that marched in 1934. He re-enlisted to fight the Germans in 1940, and in fact, again, won more military honors in 1940 fighting the Germans, escaped from a POW camp, vowing revenge against the Germans. Yet, because at Pétain's request, he headed the Milice Française, which hunted down the resistance, even though he himself was considering joining the resistance as late as 1943. So I think surprisingly in some ways, he joined the Waffen-SS, swore allegiance, swore a vow of an oath to Hitler, and was executed in 1945 for his war crimes. So he went from being one of the greatest heroes of France to one of its greatest villains. And the 2 days before he died, he wrote to Charles de Gaulle saying, the militia are authentic Frenchmen. The only mistake they made is to be faithful to a great soldier. And in many ways, this network, this connection between Pétain and these heroes, I think, played a crucial role in their finding it very hard to turn back, even when it was clear that the Germans were going to lose the war, and the fate for them was going to be fairly bleak as well. You can see, going back to the vote, does this appear in the voting patterns? We saw that there's no difference between these communes and vote in 1914, but they begin to emerge in 1924 and become accentuated by 1936. In fact, if you look at the coefficients, it does appear to be the case, consistent with complementarity, that there are increasing differences over time. These communes become more and more committed to this position. And this is again, those Verdun under Pétain communes, not the ones which happened to be kind of new Pétain back in the day before he served with these heroes at Verdun. I think this picture is pretty striking. This is Pétain. He was allowed to go to northern France, to Paris, 2 months before the Normandy invasions. And this is what Paris in April 1944 looked like. People knew that Germany was losing the war, but he still had this amazing kind of support among a lot of people in France. In fact, in a companion paper, we find that these communes also had fewer resistance in the, they were less likely to raise resistance by around 8 percentage points, though earlier in the war, they did have more military resistance. So the civilians were less likely to become resistance, but the military figures, partly because Charles de Gaulle himself had served for Pétain at Verdun. Earlier in the war, before this commitment had become more clear and more sunk, they seem to have become more likely to have a more malleable position. After the war, as I mentioned, there also are these durable effects, including, there's a share, the left vote in these communes is diminished, and the right vote is accentuated, and it's particularly the case during the military defeat, after the war in Vietnam, during the May 1968 unrest, and the election of the first socialist president of the Fifth Republic. I want to end by saying quickly that, it's not the case that war veterans and heroes have to undermine democracy. In fact, in another rigged election, in another state house, another hero, in this case, Joshua Chamberlain, who many of you knew, he saved the Union flank at the Battle of Gettysburg on the Round Top. He basically was commanding the militia in front of the state house after what was believed to be a rigged election by many. He knew he wasn't sure that the militia itself would not be politicized. So he actually climbed the steps by himself and said, he dramatically opened his jacket and said, "Man, you wish to kill me. Killing is no new thing for me. I've offered myself to be killed many times when I no more deserved it than I do now." He points out that some of you, I think, have been with me in those days, because there were veterans in the crowd from the 20th Maine, which he had served with. He goes on to talk about how he's there to preserve the peace and honor of the state and not to decide who the government is. But if they want to kill him, they can kill him. At least according to the contemporary accounts, at that point, a veteran who'd served under his command rushed to the front and said, if anyone wants to kill him, they'll have to kill me first. And so at that point, the crowd dissolved, and things actually turned out much better for Maine in 1880 than otherwise they might have done. Just to I think there are two takeaways that I'd love to discuss with you. First is that heroes who develop a very costly credential for pro-social behavior, and this can happen both through wartime heroism, but also through nonviolent civil disobedience, they can play a key role in spreading and legitimizing otherwise controversial values. And some of these can help strengthen democracy, but sometimes they can help kill it. So you have Washington and Lafayette strengthening democracy, arguably. You have Marshal Pétain, another war hero. One question I have is, what if Donald Trump had been a bit more heroic than we know him to be? If he embodied the spirit of self-sacrifice in the public, for the public, rather than some of his other things that he tended to do. What about the next Trump? What if they had those credentials as well? A second point I think that I think is important to think about and is that being embedded in complementary networks leads to escalating commitments. And this makes it hard for individuals to reverse course, and it makes debiasing more difficult. So people have been subject to all kinds of different misinformation, as we know. But if you're part of a network, even if you know that what you've heard is wrong, it's going to be very hard to turn back. And I think one thing that struck me is that when Lindsey Graham, immediately after he had basically voted to certify the election, was accosted at Reagan Airport by Trump supporters who said that he knew that the election was rigged. And when he went back to his constituency, I think many of his constituents shared that view. 2 days later, he's back with Trump on the campaign trail. So I think that it's not just a cognitive dissonance story that that drives these things that we often think about. That people, so I think many people might say, well, people have committed to being part of this network, and now it's hard to turn back. But the heroes of World War I were committed to being patriots for France. I think it's partly because they had a shared credential and were embedded in economic and social relationships with other heroes that it became very hard for them to turn back then as individuals. And so, I think that this network effect needs to really be understood better when we're thinking about how to tackle some of these challenges that we face today as well. And let me leave it at that. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Sam. That's fantastic. I welcome everyone to please invite everyone to please put their questions in the Q&A box. We already have some appearing. I wanted to ask you first, Sam, though, just exactly what are the mechanisms here of the diffusion of these values and their reinforcement, right? How do you basically both sort of create and then reinforce these complementary networks? And what is it exactly that they transmit, right? Is it appeals by Patan himself? Informal lessons, shared experiences? Basically, what are the mechanisms here that make this such a powerful force?
So I think that a key part of it is psychological, but many of them saw themselves as heroes. But there's also things that we can measure more directly, and these include the fact that they developed a very extensive veterans organizations, and that Pétain was always, he's often giving speeches to them. Many times he was kind of congratulating them for kind of being anti-communist, for being, supporting certain values. He also was in charge of the commemoration of Verdun itself. So he was the president of the committee there, where they have at Douaumont, they have a major edifice, which was actually sponsored by contributions from veterans and the communities around them, which is almost like a physical manifestation of this sort of joint view of the fortitude of those people there. In fact, all of their names are inscribed on a book, and I was hoping to go there last year, but that of course didn't happen. So they're kind of, I think, this reinforcing idea that this was a moment where France basically showed how heroic it was, and Pétain was a key part of it. It was transmits itself not only physically, like the ossuary at Douaumont, but also through these kinds of ideas that, well, I served with him, and j'ai fait Verdun, I was there. People kind of use that as a way to show how much they had sacrificed for their country, and it was recognized as such, as a sacrifice.
So there are two questions here about both the creation. Can such networks be created deliberately, right? Can you create this anti-hero that then basically supports regime change? And conversely, if a network is going in this kind of a direction, is it possible to reverse it?
I think that's a great question. I mean, I think that so. In parallel work, I'm studying nonviolent civil disobedience and how that has been used and can be used in similar ways. And those are often organic, unlike war, which has often thrust upon people, on societies. Nonviolent civil disobedience for kind of pro-social types of activities is something that we can create and has been created. It was created, most of our focus is on the Indian independence movement and the US civil rights movements. But in those cases, you have situations where people are also demonstrating self-sacrifice for the public good. And they do it in a way which establishes their heroism and makes them arguably desirable political figures who can be trusted afterwards as well. So I do think that it is the case that you can kind of create these organizations. I think war is a natural environment where this happens often, but you can do it through other means as well, where you can, if you can signal self-sacrifice. I think reversal is more challenging, and this is something I'd love to discuss with everyone here, because I think that it does mean that it is the case that we have to work at the network level. If you kind of, things which take it, recognize that perhaps the network as a whole has to be disrupted rather than sort of individuals being persuaded one by one, or focusing on particularly influential individuals within networks and seeing whether they can be kind of brought into a different discussion might be one way forward. But it's something that is, again, much more speculative. I don't know. I haven't seen an example where it's happened, so I can't test it. But it would be a good thing to learn more about for sure.
There's a related question here about sort of how are complementary networks connected with each other, right? Is it possible to sort of create a super network out of them? Something that serves to unify rather than to polarize?
Yeah, so there's, I mean, actually the French, the French veterans networks, I mean, they encompass millions of people, and they were, it wasn't just, right-wing organizations. They also had left veterans networks. They were kind of seen as cross-cutting, and in many cases, people saw them. In fact, many French historians see them as sort of as what kept France from becoming a fascist country in between the wars, because they were this cross-cutting set of people who would work together and serve together. And so what we're finding is that, part of that network was swayed by heroism, but the network as a whole, all those veterans organizations, some have argued is actually part of the glue that kept France from becoming even more fascist earlier on than other countries. So yeah, so I think this could be done, and again, even in the United States, we see like veterans organizations after the Capitol storming. They turned out to clean up some of the mess from the Capitol. I think again as a potent signal that this isn't the people who are involved in what happened in the Capitol do not speak for all veterans. They are just a small subset of the overall set of people who have served their country here as well.
Although that sounds an example of sort of countervailing network effects, right? I mean, these are substitutes rather than complements. You have the sort of the pro-democratic versus anti-democratic vets organizations that serve as substitutes for each other and make the same claims rather than work in complementary ways.
Yeah, I think you might be right.
Let's see. So there's a question here about how is it that some of the French war collaborators and criminals like Maurice Patan remain on the scene, right? And what influence do they have?
So Maurice Patan is actually great because he's in our data set. So our data set, so our file, it was introduced at his trial because he was a prefect of Bordeaux during the in the 1940s and was seen as complicit with and was convicted of being complicit with the deportation of Jews to Germany. But he later became a minister of the Interior. He was won many accolades. But at his trial, they introduced this file that we have. But then it was removed partly because people of the some of the people who were accusing him of collaboration were also in the file, and so they suppressed the file until later. And I think France itself, has this. There wasn't a coming to terms or truth and reconciliation type of event to a large extent that happened in other countries. And so, I think that is part of the reason why there are all these hidden identities in France. And a lot of people in our data set, it's declassified, but it's not been made public because a lot of people do not know what Grandpa did during the war. And, I think it could have a large set of political implications. I mean, just, yes.
Just also a question about other kinds of networks, right? I mean, some people have claimed that sort of, the QAnon conspiracy is this kind of covert network that profoundly structures beliefs about the legitimacy of democracy. And it's not, it's leaderless, but it's also marked by this sort of shared experience of, doing your own research and discovering the conspiracy itself. So I'm sort of wondering, how are the heroes necessary for these kinds of networks to arise?
Yeah, so I think the kind of the bigger thing I was grappling with is I think that's one of the big takeaways from our study is that, if Trump had been a hero, had been more heroic, I think, maybe that would have been a bigger threat to our democracy here. But the fact is, even without, such a heroic figure, and, people can argue whether he's seen as a hero by some on the right, others, some say that he sacrificed a lot by leaving New York to come to, his gilded tower in New York to come to Washington. And so there is that self-sacrifice element. But even without that, this embeddedness in the network, I think, does kind of create this situation where it's, even if you do find information that doesn't accord with your conspiracy theory, there'll be incentives to adopt it, even if you don't believe it, because other people are adopting it and so on and so forth. So, so I think that's right, that, these effects, this network aspect is really, really important.
Right. So then, Patan is just one way to form the network rather than a hero being necessary to the formation.
Yeah, I mean, from a kind of a narrow social science point of view, we were able to kind of look at one example where exogenously you get politically influential heroes, networks of people coming, but they often emerge endogenously as well. So but I think just documenting that they were complementary, I think is useful and important. That it wasn't Pétain by himself, it wasn't the heroes by themselves. It was the kind of the combination of the two, at least in France, that seemed to have had this effect.
There's a question here about the durability of some of these legacies. Is there any effect, for example, for support for Le Pen?
So we find that the effects kind of survive until the 1980s, essentially. But supporting the right until the 1980s. They've kind of diminished over time, and whether that's sort of a reflection of the end of the Cold War, a reflection of people dying and generational change. But yeah, the effects don't seem to exist in the 21st century, but they did exist for quite some time after the war.
Presumably after those heroes died, right? After the networks died out physically. There's another question here about, so the talk assumes that democracy is something worth preserving, but what if Democrats make the wrong decisions, right? What if democratic voting votes in favor of these anti-democratic conspiracy theories, leaders, heroes, etc.?
I mean, that's a great question. I think, yeah. So democratic values are, I think are a thing that is people can discuss about how important they are, whether that's the right thing to do from a normative point of view. I mean, it does seem to be the case that, well, for example, I'm British as well as American, and the day after the Brexit referendum, I honestly felt like, well, maybe this was not the best way to reach a decision about our future as a country. Maybe we needed to have a more informed citizenry before we did a referendum of this kind. So I think the solution is not to say, well, we should then get rid of democracy. I think the solution is, well, we need to figure out ways to give people incentives and the ability to become well informed in ways which are good for the country and internalize some of the gains to the country of policies. And so I think that can be done. So my answer to that is perhaps that we need to build a better democracy, not get rid of democracy, perhaps.
And what role would networks play in that?
It could go either way. That's for sure. But in other work, we're looking at how you can use financial methods to get people to become more empowered and literate and understand the economic implications of policies, as well as some of their, and focus more on the common good rather than on sort of what divides us.
So there's a question here about the sort of, the import of heroes like this in times of democratic stress versus in times of democratic sort of, durability and resilience. And you sort of, you set up the talk by talking about, the roles that heroes play in shaping values in resilient democracies. But we're talking about, 1920s and 30s Europe, which was anything but, right? And so there's a question here basically, what role do these heroes play in times of democratic stress versus in times of democratic stability?
Mm-hmm. I think that, at least our findings are that they are particularly important in times of stress. And, I think when there's a country in crisis, just like France was in the 1930s, people said, Pétain, is who we need, and we see this again when France faces a lot of political instability after the war as well. And so definitely, when things are going well, perhaps this is less important, but it's I think what's remarkable is how quickly, heroic legitimacy can sort of undermine values, even in a situation where you have a very, very long-lived democracy, which has weathered all kinds of crises in the past as well.
There's another question here about why choose to write about Pétain in France when there are so many other examples of anti-heroes?
Um, well, I think that France in the 1930s really, I mean, if you're just reading about it, the similarities to what we're seeing today are just incredibly striking, and understanding where they come from is really important as well. And so, yeah, I also study England in the 17th century and India in the medieval period. But I think all of these moments are germane to understanding how we live together in peace, as well as how we can build political coalitions that can generate beneficial public reforms. And so, I guess I'm eclectic in that sense, and as are many of you, I'm sure as well.
Let's see. I don't think we have, do we have any other questions? Okay, so in that case, Sam, I just wanted to thank you for a fantastic talk that's in some ways inspirational and in other ways very depressing, since I think we'll always have these anti-heroes with us. But thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for participating and for asking questions.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate this, Anna and Shannon and everyone out there who I can't see, but hope to continue the conversation.
Thanks very much. Take care.
Bye.